5 grueling London seasons had taught Aidan that a duke is less of a target and more of a prized commodity. After years of enduring the suffocating perfume of desperate mothers and the rehearsed giggles of 100 identical debutantes, he had become completely numb, retreating into a cold, untouchable shell. But everything changed the moment he saw her. She wasn't smiling, and she certainly wasn't looking at him. In a room full of women breaking their necks to catch his eye, she was entirely captivated by a lemon tart. The Danvers ballroom smelled of melting beeswax, wilting roses, and human desperation. Aidan Wellington, Duke of Westford, stood near the towering marble fireplace, a position he had chosen precisely because the heat emanating from the grate discouraged lingerers. It was his 5th season. He was 29 years old, in possession of a terrifyingly large fortune, and entirely hollowed out by the machinery of the English upper class. He took a sip of his champagne. It was warm. Everything in this house was warm. The air was thick with the body heat of 300 people crammed into a space meant for half that number, all moving in a synchronized, exhausting dance of social climbing. "Your Grace." Aidan didn't blink. He simply turned his head, adopting the flat, polite mask that had served as his armor since he inherited the title at 19. It was Lady Herring. Beside her stood a girl in pale pink silk, gripping a painted fan so tightly her knuckles were white. The girl's chest heaved with shallow, terrified breaths. Aidan felt a flicker of pity, sharp and useless, before he crushed it. Pity encouraged them. "Lady Herring," Aidan said, his voice a low, even gravel, "I do not believe you have been formally introduced to my youngest, Catherine." The older woman beamed. Her eyes were hard, calculating, darting over the lapels of his coat, assessing the cut of his Weston tailoring. "Catherine has a great fondness for the country, Your Grace. She paints watercolors of hounds." "Fascinating," Aidan said. The word dropped between them, heavy and dead. Catherine swallowed hard. I like the hounds, Your Grace. They run fast." Aidan stared at her. She was terrified of him. They all were. They didn't want him. They wanted the coronet, the estates in Derbyshire, the consequence of walking into a room and watching the crowd part. He was not a man to them. He was a piece of very expensive furniture they wished to acquire for their drawing rooms. "I'm afraid I do not keep hounds, Miss Catherine." Aidan lied smoothly. He owned 60. "Good evening to you both." He offered a crisp, abbreviated bow and stepped away, not waiting for the mother's sputtered protest. He moved along the perimeter of the room, keeping his back close to the silk-lined walls. His path was a gauntlet. Women adjusted their posture as he passed. Necks elongated, bosoms were thrust forward, laughter pitched higher, entirely artificial, designed to slice through the orchestra's waltz and snag his attention. "Look at me," the room screamed. "Choose me. Buy me." He had turned away 100 women. Over the years, he had perfected the art of the brutal, silent rejection. A turned shoulder, a blank stare, a conversation cut short without a shred of remorse. The society papers called him the Ice Duke. The mothers called him arrogant. They were right, but it wasn't born of cruelty. It was survival. If he allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of their expectations, the sheer naked ambition tearing at his coattails, he would lose his mind. Aidan stopped by a pillar near the terrace doors, desperate for a sliver of cool night air. He pulled his pocket watch from his waistcoat. 10 minutes past 11. He could leave in 20 minutes without causing a diplomatic incident. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the noise wash over him. The scrape of violin strings, the rustle of expensive taffeta, the clinking of crystal. It was a factory. A loud, glittering, relentless factory. And he was the prime machinery. When he opened his eyes, he looked across the sea of bobbing heads and spinning dresses, and that was when the anomaly caught his eye. She was standing in the darkest corner of the room, wedged between a potted fern and a dormant fireplace. Aidan's gaze had swept past her twice before his brain registered what was wrong with the picture. It was a matter of posture. Every woman in the Danvers ballroom stood with military precision, spines rigid, shoulders back, radiating a desperate electric energy. This woman was slouching. She leaned her shoulder against the mahogany mantelpiece. Her weight shifted heavily onto one leg. She wore a dress of deep muted green, a color several seasons out of fashion and entirely too severe for a spring ball. It had no lace, no ribbons, no absurd flounces designed to catch the candlelight. Aidan watched her. She was largely obscured by the fern, and clearly she preferred it that way. She was looking down at a small porcelain plate in her hand. On it sat a lemon tart. She inspected it with the rigorous, intense scrutiny of a jeweler examining a diamond. Then, without a shred of delicacy, she took a massive bite. Aidan blinked. The women of his acquaintance did not eat at balls. They pecked. They nibbled at the edges of shortbread to demonstrate their delicate constitutions. This woman chewed with focused, rhythmic determination. A flake of pastry fell onto her bodice. She didn't gasp or look around in horror. She simply brushed it away with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of butter on the green silk, and took another bite. Aidan found himself staring. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional porcelain doll sense of the ton. Her hair was a dark, unremarkable brown, swept up in a practical knot that was already fraying at the nape of her neck. Her features were sharp, a prominent nose, a strong jawline, eyebrows that were slightly too thick. She looked like a woman who knew the price of coal. A young man, Lord Hastings, Aidan recognized, a boy with more gambling debts than sense, stumbled toward the woman's corner. He was flushed, swaying slightly on his feet. Aidan's jaw tightened. He couldn't hear the words exchanged, but he could read the body language. Hastings leaned in, invading her space, a sloppy, arrogant grin on his face. He extended a hand, clearly demanding a dance. Aidan expected the woman to shrink back, or perhaps flutter her fan and offer a polite, terrified refusal. Instead, she didn't even look up from her plate. She swallowed her mouthful of tart, turned her head slowly, and leveled a look at Hastings. It was not a glare. It was worse. It was a look of absolute, profound boredom. She spoke a few words, short, clipped, her expression entirely deadpan. Hastings' arrogant grin evaporated. He blinked, looking entirely thrown, muttered something under his breath, and practically scurried away in the opposite direction. The woman went back to her pastry. A strange, unfamiliar sensation tightened in Aidan's chest. It took him a moment to identify it. It was amusement, true, unadulterated amusement. She hadn't looked at him once. She hadn't scanned the room. She hadn't checked to see who was watching. She existed entirely outside the frantic, suffocating ecosystem of the ballroom. She was an island of pragmatic indifference in a sea of desperation. Aidan looked at his pocket watch again. 15 minutes until he could leave. He snapped the watch shut and slipped it back into his pocket. He pushed off the pillar. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her family. He only knew that for the first time in 5 years, he wanted to speak to someone in this God-forsaken room. He began to walk. The effect of his movement was immediate. The Duke of Westford did not cross ballrooms. He stood at the edges and let people come to him. His sudden, deliberate stride toward the far side of the room sent a ripple through the crowd. Conversations died mid-sentence. Dancers on the edge of the floor missed their steps. Heads turned, a domino effect of widening eyes and whispered speculations. Who is he looking at? Where is he going? Aidan ignored them. He kept his eyes locked on the corner, on the flash of a green silk behind the fern. He waded through the crowd, his broad shoulders cutting a path. The air felt heavy, charged with the sudden, intense scrutiny of 300 people. But he didn't care. He reached the edge of the dance floor, skirted a group of stunned dowagers, and stepped into the shadowy alcove. Beatrice Hayward was calculating the precise moment her feet would begin to bleed. She guessed she had about 20 minutes left. The shoes were a hand-me-down from her cousin, half a size too small, and made of stiff leather that felt like a torture device. She shifted her weight again, pressing her spine against the cool wood of the mantelpiece, and mourned the end of her lemon tart. It had been the only redeeming feature of the evening. She hated London. She hated the noise, the fake smiles, the endless grinding arithmetic of society. She was 26, officially a spinster, and entirely at peace with it. She was only here to chaperone her younger sister Clara, who was currently on the floor, dancing with a respectable baronet. Once Clara was settled, Beatrice could return to Somerset, to the quiet, decaying manor house, her ledgers, and her dogs. A sudden hush fell over the immediate vicinity. The ambient roar of the ballroom seemed to dip, replaced by a frantic, hissing whisper. Beatrice didn't look up. She was busy trying to scrape a bit of lemon curd off her thumbnail. A shadow fell over her. A large shadow, blocking out the light from the chandeliers. "The tarts are slightly stale, wouldn't you agree?" The voice was a deep, resonant baritone. It didn't have the nasal-affected drawl of the London elite. It was grounded, rough around the edges. Beatrice sighed internally. She finally looked up, prepared to dismiss whichever drunk lord had wandered into her corner. Her eyes traveled up a broad chest encased in flawlessly cut black wool, up a crisp white cravat tied with geometric precision, to a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Sharp cheekbones, a strong, unyielding jaw, and eyes the color of slate. She didn't gasp, she didn't curtsy. She recognized him, of course. Everyone knew the Duke of Westford. He was the sun around which this entire wretched solar system orbited. Beatrice just looked at him, feeling a deep wave of exhaustion wash over her. She didn't have the energy for a duke. "The pastry's a bit dense," Beatrice said, her voice flat, keeping her tone conversational but entirely devoid of deference. "But the citrus masks the taste of the cheap butter they used in the kitchens." Aidan stared at her. For a long, stretched second, he didn't say anything. The silence hung between them, thick and heavy. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was a minute movement, barely there, but Beatrice caught it. "Cheap butter," he repeated, the words rolling slowly off his tongue. "Yes," Beatrice said, unapologetic. "Lord Danvers is famously tight-fisted. He imports his wines but cuts corners on the domestic staples. It's a false economy." She waited for him to walk away. She had just insulted their host's kitchens to a peer of the realm. A normal woman would be mortified. Beatrice just wanted to sit down. Aidan didn't leave. He took a step closer, moving into the small space between the fern and the wall. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "And yet," Aidan murmured, "you ate the entire thing." "I was hungry," she replied simply. "Pride rarely wins against an empty stomach, Your Grace." She used his title deliberately, dropping it like a stone to see if it would change the dynamic. It usually did. Men of his rank expected a certain groveling reverence when their titles were invoked. Aidan leaned his shoulder against the mantelpiece, mirroring her posture. He was close enough now that she could smell him. No cloying colognes, just clean linen, faint soap, and the cold night air. "You know who I am," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I have eyes, Your Grace," Beatrice said dryly, "and ears. It is difficult to avoid the subject of you in a room like this. The collective ambition in this ballroom could power a steam engine." Aidan let out a sound. It was sharp, sudden, and startlingly rough. It took Beatrice a second to realize it was a laugh. The Ice Duke had just laughed at her. "A steam engine," he echoed, looking out over the crowd. "That is an apt description. It feels rather like being caught in the gears." He turned his gaze back to her. His slate-gray eyes were intense, pinning her in place. The cold, blank mask she had observed from a distance was gone. He looked tired, deeply, fundamentally tired. It was an exhaustion she recognized in her own bones. "Are you lost, Your Grace?" she asked, genuinely curious. "The perimeter of the room is usually your designated territory. The dowagers will be having heart palpitations, wondering why you've waded into the weeds." "I am not lost," Aidan said quietly. "I am seeking refuge." Beatrice arched an eyebrow. "From?" "The cattle market." The bluntness of his words surprised her. It was a crude term, entirely accurate, but one never spoken aloud in these circles. "You are the prize bull," Beatrice pointed out, lacking any filter. "You can hardly complain about the auction." Aidan shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest. "I assure you I can. And I do. Constantly, though usually in the privacy of my own carriage." He paused, studying her face. "You, however, do not seem to be participating in the auction." Aki, I am 26, penniless, and entirely lacking in the necessary simpering skills, Beatrice said, ticking the points off on her fingers. I am unmarketable. Therefore, I am invisible. It is wonderfully liberating. Invisible, Aiden repeated softly. He looked at the smudge of butter on her green bodice. He looked at the fraying hair at her neck. He looked at her dark, defiant eyes. I saw you, he said. The words were spoken softly, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. Beatrice felt a sudden strange jolt in her chest. She frowned, breaking eye contact, unnerved by the intensity in his gaze. You saw a woman eating a tart, she corrected, forcing her tone to remain brisk. Hardly a riveting spectacle. I saw a woman, Aiden countered, who told Lord Hastings exactly where he could put his dancing shoes without raising her voice. Beatrice snorted, a very unladylike sound. Hastings is an idiot. He stepped on my hem last week and didn't apologize. I merely informed him that if he came within 3 feet of me again, I would inform his creditors of his current location. Aiden stared at her for a long time. The noise of the ballroom, the frantic waltz, the shrieking laughter, the desperate hum of the social machine seemed to fade, muffled by the heavy velvet curtain of their shared isolation. He didn't want to go back to the perimeter. He didn't want to go back to his cold, quiet townhouse. For the first time in a decade, he wanted to stay exactly where he was. What's your name? He asked, his voice low. Beatrice, she said, before her brain could catch up with her mouth. Beatrice Hayward. Miss Hayward. He tested the name, finding the weight of it satisfactory. I am Aiden. Beatrice looked up at him. She saw the Duke of Westford, yes. But beneath the tailoring and the title, she saw a man who looked like he had been holding his breath for a very long time. Well, Aiden, Beatrice said, leaning back against the mantelpiece and folding her arms. If you are going to hide in my corner, you are going to have to make yourself useful. Fetch me another tart. Aiden Wellington, the most powerful peer in England, the man who had turned away 100 women with a glance, looked at the empty plate in her hand. Then, slowly, a genuine smile broke across his face. As you wish, Miss Hayward. Aiden walked away from the alcove, leaving Beatrice Hayward alone with her empty plate. He did not immediately return to his designated perimeter. He crossed the ballroom floor with the deliberate, heavy tread of a man who owned the very floorboards beneath his boots. The sea of silk and broadcloth parted for him. Conversations paused, hanging suspended in the stifling air as hundreds of eyes tracked his trajectory. He was heading for the buffet tables. The Duke of Westford did not fetch his own refreshments. He had an army of footmen in his employ for that precise purpose, and failing that, any hostess would eagerly summon a servant to attend him before he could even express a desire. To see him navigating the gauntlet of minor gentry to reach the linen-draped tables was akin to watching a monarch wash his own carriage. Aiden reached the tables. A young footman in the Danvers green and gold livery froze, a silver pair of tongs hovering over a tray of glazed ham. The boy's eyes went perfectly round. Your Grace, the footman squeaked, his voice cracking. Aiden looked at the sprawling spread. Pyramids of hothouse grapes, sweating joints of beef, spun sugar chips that looked entirely inedible. And there, tucked behind a towering centerpiece of wilting lilies, was a silver platter of lemon tarts. The tarts, Aiden said, his voice a low rumble. Give me 2. The footman fumbled, dropping the meat tongs with a loud clatter. He scrambled for a fresh china plate, his hands shaking so violently the porcelain rattled against the silver tray. He managed to deposit 2 small yellow pastries onto the plate and held it out as if offering a sacrifice to a temperamental god. Aiden took the plate. Thank you. The footman looked like he might faint. Aiden turned back toward the ballroom. The silence had taken on a brittle electric quality. He could feel the collective weight of their confusion. He ignored it, locking his gaze on the dark corner where the fern stood. Beatrice was exactly where he had left her. She was watching his approach, her head tilted slightly, a look of profound skepticism etched across her sharp features. He stepped back into the shadow of the alcove and extended the plate. "Et tu," Beatrice noted, making no immediate move to take one. "Are you feeling gluttonous, Your Grace, or merely thorough?" One for you, Aidan replied, his arm remaining perfectly steady. One for me. You claimed the citrus masks the cheap butter. I wish to test this hypothesis. Beatrice let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the porcelain. Her hands were not soft. There were faint calluses on her knuckles, the kind earned from gripping reins or scrubbing ink from ledgers, not from sitting idle in a parlor. She took a tart. Aidan took the other. He set the empty plate down on the mahogany mantelpiece with a dull clink. They stood side by side in the dim light, two figures entirely out of place amidst the glittering chaos. Aidan looked down at the pastry in his hand. He had not eaten a sweet at a ball in a decade. He took a bite. It was dense. The crust crumbled dryly against his tongue, and the curd was a violently tart assault, followed immediately by the greasy, unmistakable coating of inferior fat. Good God, Aidan muttered, swallowing with difficulty. It tastes like sweetened floor wax. I told you, Beatrice said, chewing her own with mechanical efficiency. Lord Danvers is a fraud. He spent £3,000 on the floral arrangements in the entryway and serves his guests lard in the dining room. It tells you everything you need to know about the man. Aidan looked at her. She wasn't trying to be clever. She was stating a fact, analyzing the economy of the room with a cold, clear eye. And what? Aidan asked, wiping a crumb from his thumb. Does it tell you about me? Beatrice paused. She swallowed, brushing her hands together to rid them of the crust. She turned her head, looking at him fully for the first time since he had returned. Her dark eyes swept over his coat, his cravat, the heavy gold signet ring on his left hand. It tells me that you are terribly bored, she said evenly. You're standing in a corner eating terrible pastry with a spinster because the alternative is returning to a room full of people who want to strip you down and sell you for parts. The sheer, unvarnished honesty of it hit Aidan like a physical blow. He wasn't used to honesty. He was used to flattery, to calculated deference, to lies wrapped in silk. You do not mince words, Miss Hayward. I cannot afford to, Your Grace. Time is a luxury, and I have very little of it. She looked past him, her eyes scanning the brightly lit dance floor. My sister's card is full tonight, but the men dancing with her are second sons and impoverished baronets. They are looking for dowries she does not possess. I have perhaps 3 more weeks to secure a practical match for her before our funds run dry, and we must return to Somerset. Aidan followed her gaze. He spotted the girl she was watching, a younger, softer version of Beatrice, with lighter hair and a desperate, fragile smile, currently being spun around by a man whose coat was shiny at the elbows. Clara, Beatrice provided the name without him asking. She is 19. She believes in love. It is a terrifying defect. And you? Aidan asked, looking back at Beatrice. Do you not believe in love? I believe in a secure roof and a warm hearth, Beatrice said flatly. Love does not pay the butcher. Aidan felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. It was the same cynicism that had kept him alive in this world, mirrored back at him in a woman who had none of his wealth or protection. She was fighting a war of attrition, and she was losing. You need her to marry well, Aidan stated, his mind shifting from the abstract to the practical. He was a duke. He understood power. He understood leverage. I need her to marry safely, Beatrice corrected. There is a distinction. Aidan looked at the dance floor, then down at the woman beside him. She was shifting her weight again, a grimace briefly tightening her lips. Your shoes do not fit, he observed. Beatrice stiffened. They are fine. They are pinching your heels. You have shifted your weight entirely to your left foot 4 times in the last 10 minutes. Your Grace, she said, her tone sharp. My footwear is hardly the concern of the realm. No, Aidan agreed slowly. But your sister is. Or she could be. Beatrice frowned, her thick eyebrows pulling together. What are you talking about? Aidan stepped away from the mantelpiece. The faint, mocking amusement had vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, calculating expression he wore when negotiating land disputes or unseating political rivals in the House of Lords. You need your sister noticed by men of substance, men with estates and unencumbered incomes, Aidan said. Currently, she is invisible to them because your family lacks consequence. You are wallflowers. Beatrice's jaw tightened. I'm aware of our social standing, thank you. I'm not insulting you, Miss Hayward. I'm stating a fact. Aiden held out his hand, palm up. The white glove was stark against the dim backdrop. I can change that fact in exactly 3 minutes. Beatrice stared at his hand as if it were a loaded pistol. How? Dance with me. Beatrice did not move. She looked from Aiden's outstretched hand to his face, searching for the punchline. Dukes did not ask penniless spinsters to dance. They especially did not ask spinsters wearing out-of-date gowns and borrowed shoes. This is a cruel joke, Your Grace, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I'm not one of your ton debutantes. I will not play a part in whatever game you are constructing to alleviate your boredom. It is not a game, Aiden said, his hand remaining perfectly still. It is mathematics. He took a half-step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear the rumble of it. If I walk out onto that floor with you, every single eye in this room will follow. The dowagers will demand to know who you are. The lords will inquire about your family. By tomorrow morning, the Hayward name will be spoken in 50 drawing rooms. Your sister will cease to be a poor country girl and will become the sister of the woman the Duke of Westford singled out. Her dance card will be filled with earls by Tuesday. Beatrice swallowed. Her mind, usually so sharp and ordered, spun wildly. He was right. It was a brutal, cynical manipulation of the social economy, and it would absolutely work. And what, she asked, her voice tight, is your price? Men like you do not give away your consequence for free. My price, Aiden said softly, is that for the next 15 minutes, I do not have to pretend to care about hounds or watercolors or the weather in Bath. I require a partner who will not look at me like I am a sack of gold coins. You need a billboard. I need an anchor. He waited. He did not push. He offered the transaction with the blunt transparency of a merchant. Beatrice looked at her sister. Clara was laughing, a thin, fragile sound that barely covered the panic in her eyes as the poor baronet stepped on her toes. Beatrice loved her. She loved her enough to endure London, enough to wear agonizing shoes, enough to swallow her pride. She looked back at Aiden. It is a waltz. I am aware. I do not waltz gracefully. My shoes are killing me. I will steer, Aiden said. Beatrice took a breath, bracing herself. She reached out and placed her gloved hand in his. The moment their fingers locked, the energy in the alcove shifted. Aiden's grip was firm, entirely grounded. He didn't offer the limp, perfunctory hold of the society dandies. He held her as if he intended to keep her upright through a storm. He led her out of the shadows. The effect was instantaneous and deafening. It was not a physical sound, but the sudden, shocking cessation of 100 conversations. As Aiden stepped onto the polished wood of the dance floor, leading a woman in faded green silk, the Danvers ballroom went entirely still. Even the orchestra seemed to falter, the lead violinist dragging his bow in a harsh squeak before recovering the tempo. Aiden did not look at the crowd. He turned to Beatrice, placed his right hand firmly on the small of her back, and pulled her into the frame. Breathe, Miss Hayward, he murmured. I am breathing, she lied, her chest frozen. You are holding your breath like a soldier facing a firing squad. Look at me, only at me. Beatrice forced her eyes up to his face. The slate gray of his eyes was intense, locking onto hers with a demanding, singular focus. He stepped forward on the downbeat, sweeping her into the turn. Beatrice stumbled. The stiff leather of her right shoe bit viciously into her heel. She gasped, a small, involuntary sound of pain, and began to apologize. Before she could speak, Aiden shifted his hold. His hand on her waist tightened, bearing a significant portion of her weight. He altered his stride, shortening his steps, pulling her closer so she didn't have to stretch her legs to match his long gait. It was a subtle adjustment, invisible to the gaping audience, but it took the pressure entirely off her bleeding feet. Better? He asked, his voice low over the swell of the cellos. Yes, Beatrice breathed, genuinely shocked. Thank you. Do not thank me. Look annoyed. It will confuse them. Beatrice let out a startled bark of laughter, the sound loud and unrefined. Several heads snapped toward them, dowagers clutching their pearls in horror. You are enjoying this, she accused him, a small, genuine smile breaking through her rigid composure. Immensely, Aiden admitted. The heavy, deadened weight that had sat on his chest for 5 years felt remarkably lighter. He was holding a woman who smelled of lavender soap, not French perfume. A woman who leaned into his support not out of manufactured frailty, but because her shoes were cheap. She was spectacularly real. "They are staring," Beatrice whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of his white cravat. "Let them stare. They are calculating your net worth. It is currently rising by the second." Aiden executed a smooth turn, keeping his body between her and the worst of the glaring dowagers. "Your sister is currently being approached by Lord Miller. He owns half of Sussex." Beatrice's head jerked, trying to look, but Aiden's hand pressed firmly against her spine, holding her in place. "Do not look," he commanded softly. "You must appear entirely unbothered. You are dancing with a duke. You do not care about Lord Miller." "Right, of course." Beatrice forced herself to relax slightly against his arm. The pain in her feet was a dull throb now, entirely eclipsed by the surreal nature of the moment. She was gliding across a floor she had been hiding from, held by a man who was supposed to be untouchable. "Tell me about Somerset," Aiden said abruptly. "Somerset? Yes? You said you wished to return there. Tell me why." Beatrice looked up at him. He wasn't making polite conversation. His eyes were engaged, his jaw relaxed. He actually wanted to know. "It is quiet," she said softly. "The house is falling apart, the roof leaks in the west wing, and the soil is mostly clay. But it is honest. The dogs do not care if my gown is 3 seasons old. The ledgers balance or they do not. There is no pretense." "It sounds like heaven," Aiden said, and the profound sincerity in his voice caught her entirely off guard. The music swelled to a crescendo and began to fade. Aiden slowed their rotation, bringing them to a perfectly controlled stop near the edge of the floor. He did not immediately release her waist. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, he held her there, suspended in the bubble they had created. Then he stepped back, offering a perfectly executed deep bow. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Hayward." Beatrice offered a shallow, practical curtsy. "Thank you for the leverage, Your Grace." Aiden's mouth twitched. He turned and walked away, carving a path through the stunned crowd, leaving Beatrice standing in the light, the most talked-about woman in London. The next morning, the Duke of Westford's study was a sanctuary of silence. The room was vast, lined with mahogany bookshelves that smelled of old paper and leather bindings. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn back to let in the pale gray London light. Aiden sat behind a massive desk, staring at a stack of estate reports from Derbyshire. He had read the same paragraph regarding a collapsed tenant roof 4 times. He had comprehended none of it. His mind kept returning to a smudge of butter on green silk. His valet, a stoic man named Roberts, had informed him upon waking that the Westford townhouse had received 24 calling cards before 10 o'clock. The ton was in a frenzy. The Ice Duke had danced. Not only had he danced, but he had danced with a nobody, a spinster. Aiden pushed the reports away, the vellum sliding across the polished wood with a dry hiss. He stood up, walking to the window and looking out over the manicured square. It was entirely absurd. He had performed a calculated maneuver to assist a desperate woman, and in doing so, he had upended his own rigidly ordered life. Yet, he felt no regret. The hollow, suffocating numbness that usually defined his mornings in the city was gone. Instead, he felt a restless, itching curiosity. He turned back to the room. "Roberts." The door opened silently. "Your Grace? Have the carriage brought round. No crest. The plain black lacquered one." Roberts did not blink. "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I inform your secretary to cancel your afternoon appointments at the club?" "Yes," Aiden said, pulling his pocket watch from his waistcoat. "I have a matter of accounting to discuss." An hour later, the unmarked carriage pulled to a halt on a narrow, soot-stained street on the fringes of Mayfair. It was the sort of neighborhood where the paint peeled from the door frames and the smell of boiled cabbage hung perennially in the air. It was entirely unsuitable for a peer of the realm. Aiden stepped out, ignoring the wide-eyed stare of a passing sweeping boy. He approached the dark blue door of number 14 and rapped the brass knocker. A maid opened the door. She was young, wearing a cap that sat slightly crooked on her head, and her apron bore a distinct smear of ash. She stared at Aiden's towering figure and flawlessly tailored dark blue riding coat. "I'm here to see Miss Beatrice Hayward," Aiden said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for refusal. She's in the parlor, sir. I mean, my lord." The maid stepped back, gesturing to a door off the narrow, drafty hallway. Aiden didn't wait to be announced. He opened the door and stepped inside. The parlor was cramped, the furniture was chintz, faded by years of sunlight, and a meager fire fought a losing battle against the damp chill in the hearth. Beatrice was sitting at a small, rickety writing desk pushed against the window to catch the meager light. She was wearing a plain gray wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense braid. She was hunched over a large, leather-bound ledger, a pen clamped tightly in her hand, ink staining the side of her thumb. She didn't look up. "Clara, I have told you the ribbon is 3 shillings. We cannot afford it if you are to have gloves for the theater on Thursday." Aiden closed the door softly behind him. "I assure you I have no need for ribbons." Beatrice's head snapped up. The pen slipped from her fingers, leaving a heavy blot of black ink on the page. She stared at him, her dark eyes wide with shock. "Your Grace!" She stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the wooden floorboards. She looked wildly around the tiny, shabby room, a sudden, fierce blush staining her cheeks. It was the first time he had seen her look anything other than completely in control. "I apologize for the intrusion," Aiden said, stepping further into the room. He seemed to take up all the available air. "I realized we left our transaction somewhat unfinished last night." Beatrice hurriedly wiped her ink-stained thumb on a scrap of blotting paper. "Transaction?" "The leverage," Aiden reminded her. He pulled a folded piece of heavy cream-colored paper from his inner pocket and placed it on the small table near the door. "An invitation. For my aunt, the Duchess of Cleves. She's hosting a dinner party on Friday. A small affair, only 30 people. But the guest list includes 2 dukes, an unmarried Marcus, and Lord Miller." Beatrice stared at the paper. The Duchess of Cleves was society royalty. An invitation from her was a golden ticket. It was absolute, undeniable validation. "You did this," she said, her voice unsteady. "I merely suggested to my aunt that she was neglecting her duty to foster new acquaintances," Aiden said smoothly. "She is a terrible snob, but she listens to me when I threaten to cut off funding for her favorite charities." Beatrice looked from the invitation to Aiden. The blush faded, replaced by that familiar, piercing scrutiny. "Why are you doing this? The dance was enough. This is meddling." "Perhaps." Aiden walked slowly toward the writing desk. He looked down at the open ledger. The columns of numbers were written in a sharp, precise hand. He saw the tight margins, the careful rationing of shillings and pence. It was a map of survival. "You're balancing the household accounts," he noted. "I am trying to keep us from debtor's prison," Beatrice corrected, stepping defensively in front of the desk, shielding the book from his view. "It is not a spectacle for your amusement." "I am not amused, Miss Hayward. I'm an estate manager myself. I understand the weight of numbers." Aiden met her gaze, his expression entirely serious. "I have 5 estates, 400 tenants, and a coal mine. I spend my days looking at ledgers just like that one. The scale is different, but the math is the same. Money out must not exceed money in." Beatrice paused. She looked at him, truly looked at him. He wasn't mocking her poverty. He was speaking to her as an equal, as a fellow pragmatist fighting a war on a ledger. "It is a brutal mathematics," Beatrice said quietly. Yes, it is." Aiden stepped closer, stopping only when the hem of his coat brushed the rough wool of her skirt. The scent of lavender was stronger here, cutting through the smell of damp plaster and cheap coal. "I came because I wanted to see you in the daylight. I wanted to see if the woman in the ballroom was real." Beatrice tilted her chin up. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she held her ground. "And? Am I real?" "Yes," Aiden breathed, the word rough and quiet. "You're the most real thing I've encountered in 5 years." He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so she could pull away. He didn't touch her face or her waist. He reached down and gently took her right hand, the one stained with ink. He turned it over, his thumb brushing lightly over the ink-smudged skin and the calluses on her palm. It was a starkly intimate gesture, devoid of romance but heavy with understanding. "Your sister will be safe, Beatrice," he said, using her Christian name for the first time. It felt like a stone dropping into a quiet pond. "I will ensure it. You have my word." Beatrice looked down at his large, immaculate hand, holding her rough, stained one. The crushing, solitary weight she had carried for years suddenly felt a fraction lighter. She didn't say thank you. She knew he didn't want gratitude. "The coal here is terrible," she said instead, her voice a slightly hoarse whisper. "It smokes." Aidan let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated in the small room. He didn't let go of her hand. "Then I shall have to send you some from Derbyshire. It burns much cleaner." The dining room of the Duchess of Cleves was intimidating by design. The walls were lined in crimson silk, the ceiling was heavily gilded, and the mahogany table was large enough to seat 30 with acreage to spare. It smelled of roasted pheasant, hot wax, and the quiet, crushing arrogance of old money. Beatrice sat near the lower middle, flanked by an elderly colonel who was entirely deaf in his left ear, and a young vicar who looked terrified of the silverware. She wore the green silk again. She had spent 2 hours the previous night carefully unpicking the frayed hem and turning the fabric, a desperate, painstaking effort to make it look presentable. It still looked like a relic next to the cascades of French lace and heavy brocades worn by the other women. But Beatrice didn't care about the dress. She was watching Clara. Her sister was seated near the head of the table, currently engaged in a breathless, animated conversation with Lord Miller. The Viscount was a stolid, unimaginative man in his late 30s, but his eyes crinkled kindly when he smiled, and he was listening to Clara with genuine, undivided attention. The social machinery, kick-started by Aidan's single dance, had worked flawlessly. "I am told the hunting in Somerset is quite bleak, Miss Hayward," a voice cut across the table. It was Lady Carstairs. She was a woman built like a pigeon, entirely composed of sharp angles and puffed-up self-importance. She had been staring at Beatrice's unadorned neckline for the past 20 minutes. The low hum of conversation in their immediate vicinity died down. The wealthy loved a blood sport, and a penniless spinster was easy prey. Beatrice set her fork down. She met Lady Carstairs' cold, reptilian gaze. "It depends entirely on what you are hunting, Lady Carstairs," Beatrice replied evenly. "If you are looking for foxes, it is indeed poor. If you are looking for quiet, it is quite abundant." "Quiet," Lady Carstairs sniffed, an ugly, dismissive sound. "I suppose one must cultivate a taste for quiet when one lacks the means for society. Tell me, do your tenants pay in coin, or do they barter with turnips?" A few suppressed titters rippled along the silk-lined chairs. The vicar beside Beatrice stared intensely at his soup. Beatrice felt the familiar hot prickle of humiliation at the base of her neck. This was the tax she paid for entering their world. She took a slow breath, preparing a response that would be polite enough to avoid a scene, but sharp enough to draw blood. Before she could open her mouth, the heavy clatter of a silver goblet hitting a porcelain plate echoed from the head of the table. It was a jarring, violent sound. Every head turned. Aidan was sitting at his aunt's right hand. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting lightly on the edge of the table. His expression was lethally blank. He bypassed the 15 people sitting between them and fixed his slate-gray eyes entirely on Lady Carstairs. "Lady Carstairs," Aidan said. His voice did not echo, but the low, gravelly timbre of it carried perfectly. "I was just reviewing the deed to the hunting lodge your husband leases from my estate in Yorkshire. The roof requires extensive repairs." Lady Carstairs blanched. The smug cruelty evaporated from her face, replaced by sudden, naked panic. "Your Grace, my husband was assured the lease was secure for another 10 years. Things change," Aidan said softly, "particularly when I find myself suddenly displeased with the maintenance of my properties. I will have my steward look into it tomorrow. I believe you may need to find alternative accommodations for the autumn season." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a brutal, unvarnished display of power. He had just publicly threatened to evict a baron over an insult directed at a spinster from Somerset. He didn't wait for Lady Carstairs to stammer a reply. He shifted his gaze down the table, locking eyes with Beatrice. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a reassuring nod. He just looked at her, a silent, heavy confirmation. I see them, and I see you. Beatrice's chest tightened. The air in her lungs felt suddenly too thin. She was not a woman who required rescuing. She had fought her own battles for years, but looking at the man at the head of the table, she realized with a terrifying jolt that he hadn't stepped in to rescue her. He had stepped in because the insult to her felt like an insult to him. They were aligned. It was a terrifying, impossible thought. The Duchess of Cleves, a shrewd woman who missed absolutely nothing, cleared her throat and loudly asked Lord Miller his opinion on the new paving in Mayfair. The conversation fractured and resumed, high-pitched and frantic. Lady Carstairs did not speak another word for the rest of the meal. When dinner concluded, the men retired for port, and the women moved to the drawing room. Beatrice lingered in the hallway, pressing her back against the cool, flocked wallpaper, desperate for a moment of silence. A side door clicked open. Aidan stepped out of the library. He had bypassed the port entirely. He saw her, and the rigid tension in his shoulders seemed to instantly dissolve. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. In the dim light of the corridor wall sconces, he looked less like a duke and more like a man who was simply tired of the noise. "You did not have to do that," Beatrice said softly. "Do what?" "Threaten Lady Carstairs' Yorkshire lease." "I didn't threaten it. I am actually going to revoke it. Her husband is an idiot who lets the damp rot the floorboards." Aidan crossed his arms, but the timing was remarkably convenient. Beatrice let out a breath, looking down at her scuffed shoes. "You made me a spectacle, Aidan." "You were already a spectacle. I merely changed the narrative." He stepped closer, invading her space with that quiet, grounding gravity of his. "Did she upset you?" "No," Beatrice lied. Then, sighing, she corrected herself. "Yes, she is cruel. But she's also right. I do not belong here. The math does not work." Aidan reached out. He didn't take her hand this time. He touched the side of her face, his thumb brushing a stray lock of dark hair back from her temple. His touch was warm, slightly rough, and entirely devastating. "Forget the math, Beatrice," he murmured, his voice a low, rough scrape against her nerves. "Just for tonight. Forget the math." Beatrice closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of his palm for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and stepped back. "I can never forget the math," she said, her voice shaking. "It is the only thing keeping me alive." 3 weeks later, the mathematics resolved themselves perfectly. Lord Miller proposed to Clara in the Danvers Rose Garden. Clara, weeping tears of genuine relief and affection, accepted. The Viscount, proving himself not just wealthy but honorable, insisted on a short engagement and a generous settlement that would ensure both Clara and Beatrice would never worry about coal again. The war was won. The Hayward townhouse was a chaos of open trunks, tissue paper, and the sharp smell of camphor. Beatrice stood in the center of the parlor, methodically wrapping a porcelain teapot in an old linen towel. She was returning to Somerset in the morning, alone. Clara would stay with Lord Miller's aunt until the wedding. The heavy knocker sounded at the front door. Beatrice paused, her hands tightening on the teapot. The maid, flustered and coated in dust, opened the parlor door a moment later. "The Duke of Westford, miss." Aidan walked in. He looked at the trunks. He looked at the rolled-up rugs. He looked at the stripped, empty room. The cold, blank mask he wore in public was firmly in place, but his slate-gray eyes were dark and stormy. "You are leaving," he stated. "My sister is engaged," Beatrice said, setting the teapot carefully into a crate. She kept her voice brisk, professional. "Our objective is complete. There's no longer any reason to maintain the expense of a London lease." Aidan slowly closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the bare room. "No reason," he repeated, the words flat. "None." Beatrice forced herself to look at him. It was a mistake. He looked magnificent, dressed in a dark gray riding habit, his presence entirely overwhelming the small, shabby room. She felt a physical ache in her chest, a hollow, scraping pain that she ruthlessly shoved down. "I want to thank you, Your Grace. Your intervention was the catalyst. We are in your debt." "Do not call me that." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch. He stepped over a pile of books, ignoring the dust on his polished boots. "You have called me Aiden for 3 weeks. Do not retreat behind my title now." "We are returning to our proper stations," Beatrice said, backing up slightly until her hip hit the edge of the writing desk. "The arrangement is concluded." "Arrangement?" Aiden let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Is that what this was to you? A transaction? I danced with you. I intimidated half the ton on your behalf. I spent the last 3 weeks finding excuses to sit in this freezing, drafty parlor just to watch you balance an account book. And you are calling it an arrangement? What else could it be?" Beatrice snapped, her own temper flaring, fueled by exhaustion and a breaking heart. "Look at me. Look at this room. You own half of Derbyshire. I own 3 leaking roofs and a lame horse. Dukes do not marry spinsters from Somerset, Aiden. They marry daughters of earls. They marry political alliances. You know the rules of your own world." "I do not care about the rules," Aiden shouted. The raw volume of it shocked them both into silence. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath the fine wool of his coat. He closed the distance between them, stopping inches away. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I have lived by their rules for 10 years, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "I have turned away 100 women because they looked at me and saw a bank vault. You looked at me and saw a man eating a bad pastry. You didn't want my title. You didn't want my money. You just wanted me to pass you the plate." Beatrice swallowed the lump in her throat. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Crying was useless. "That does not change reality," she whispered. "If we tried this, society would tear you down. They would whisper that you lost your mind. They would cut me dead at every turn. It would be a relentless, exhausting war, and eventually you would resent me for the cost." "You think me that weak?" "I think the world is that cruel." Beatrice pushed away from the desk, wrapping her arms around her chest. "I have secured my sister's future. I have done my duty. I'm tired, Aiden. I just want to go home to the quiet. I cannot survive your world." Aiden stared at her. The anger slowly bled out of him, replaced by a profound, desolate understanding. She wasn't rejecting him. She was retreating. She had fought her war, won her single victory, and had nothing left in her reserves to fight a second front. He stepped back. The cold, impenetrable mask slammed back into place over his features, locking away the vulnerability. "I see," he said. His voice was dead, devoid of any inflection. "Pragmatism above all." "It is all I have," she said quietly. "Then I wish you a safe journey, Miss Hayward." He offered a short, brutally formal bow. He turned and walked out of the parlor. A moment later, the heavy front door slammed shut, rattling the windows in their frames. Beatrice stood alone in the dust. She picked up another piece of porcelain, wrapped it carefully, and finally, silently, began to weep. The rain in Somerset was not like London rain. It was not a polite drizzle. It was a heavy, relentless downpour that turned the roads to soup and drummed against the roof of Hayward Manor with a deafening roar. Beatrice sat in her father's old study, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was staring at a ledger, but she hadn't written a number in an hour. It had been 2 months. Clara was married. The debts were paid. The house was quiet. It was a suffocating, unbearable quiet. She had gotten exactly what she wanted, and she had never been more miserable in her entire life. She missed the sharp bite of London air. She missed the ridiculousness of the ballroom. She missed slate-gray eyes and dry wit and the way a giant, terrifying man could make her feel entirely, perfectly safe. A loud commotion erupted from the front hall. The hounds, 4 mismatched, scruffy mongrels, began barking frantically. Beatrice frowned. No one visited in this weather. She stood up, pulling the blanket tighter, and walked out into the drafty corridor. The heavy oak front door was open. Wind and rain whipped into the entryway. Standing on the threadbare carpet, dripping water onto the floorboards, was Aiden. He looked terrible. His greatcoat was soaked through, plastered heavily to his broad shoulders. His boots were caked in thick gray Somerset mud. He was not wearing a hat, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked entirely stripped of his ducal consequence. He just looked like a man who had ridden through a storm. One of the hounds, a terrier mix, was currently sniffing his ruined Hessian boots. Aiden ignored the dog, his eyes locked on Beatrice as she froze at the end of the hall. "Your roof is leaking," Aiden said loudly over the sound of the rain. Beatrice blinked, her brain struggling to process the visual. "I know." Aiden walked toward her. He didn't care about the mud he was tracking onto the floor. He didn't care about the dogs trailing behind him. He stopped a few feet away, reaching into the inner pocket of his saturated coat. He pulled out a thick folded sheaf of paper. The edges were slightly damp, but the wax seal remained intact. He held it out. "What is that?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It is a contract," Aiden said. "I had my solicitors draw it up yesterday. I rode through the night to get here." Beatrice didn't take the paper. She stared at it. "Aiden, what are you doing?" "I'm adjusting the math." He stepped closer. The smell of rain, wet wool, and horse was overwhelming, but underneath it, she could smell the faint, familiar scent of clean linen and soap. "You said my world would destroy you," Aiden continued, his voice rough and low. "You said society would wage a war against us, and you were too tired to fight it. I spent 2 months sitting in my pristine, quiet study, realizing you were entirely correct. You are exhausted. You should not have to fight." He grabbed her hand, the one clutching the blanket, and pressed the heavy parchment against her palm. So I am removing the battlefield," he said. "I have transferred the management of the Derbyshire and Yorkshire estates to my stewards. I have shuttered the London townhouse. I have resigned my committee seats in the House of Lords. I told my aunt she could take her dinner parties and host them in hell." Beatrice's jaw dropped. She looked at the paper, then back up at his face. You cannot do that. You are the Duke of Westford." "I am Aiden," he corrected fiercely. "The title is a piece of paper. It is a factory, Beatrice, and I quit." He reached up, grasping her shoulders. His hands were cold from the rain, but his grip was solid, grounding her to the floorboards. "The contract in your hand is a transfer of funds," Aiden explained, his eyes burning into hers. "It outlines the complete restoration of this manor, the replanting of your tenant farms, and the establishment of an independent income in your name. It is not a dowry. It is an investment. I am investing in Somerset." Beatrice's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might shatter. "Why?" "Because I want to live here," Aiden said. The brutal, cynical mask was entirely gone. He looked terrified, hopeful, and painfully human. "I want to live in a house with a leaking roof, and dogs that muddy the floors. I want to eat terrible pastry and argue with you over ledgers. I don't want a duchess, Beatrice. I want a partner. I want you." He let go of her shoulders and took a half step back, giving her space. "If you truly want the quiet alone," he said softly, "you can tear that paper up. I will get back on my horse, and you will never see me again. But do not send me away because you think you are not enough. You are the only real thing in my life. You are the only woman who ever saw me." Beatrice looked down at the heavy, damp paper in her hand. It was a fortune. It was security. It was everything she had ever scraped and bled to achieve. But looking at the wet, muddy, magnificent man standing in her hallway, she realized the money was entirely irrelevant. She dropped the contract. It hit the floorboards with a soft thud. Aiden's breath hitched. He looked down at the paper, a flash of absolute devastation crossing his features. "The dogs will chew that if you leave it there," Beatrice whispered. Aiden's head snapped up. Beatrice let the blanket fall from her shoulders. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and rested her hands flat against his soaked chest. She could feel the heavy, frantic pounding of his heart beneath the wet wool. "You're going to ruin my floor," she said, a tear finally slipping hot and fast down her cheek. "And you will have to learn how to fix the roof yourself. I refuse to pay a carpenter." Aiden let out a sound, a broken, shuddering breath that was half laugh, half sob. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him, lifting her slightly off her feet. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, ignoring the dampness of his coat soaking through her dress. "I will build the damn roof with my bare hands," he swore into her skin. Beatrice wrapped her arms around his neck, tangling her fingers in his wet hair. She closed her eyes, listening to the rain batter the old house. The ledgers were closed. The war was over. The ice duke had melted in the middle of a Somerset storm, and Beatrice finally, truly, felt warm. Sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't a fiery speech. It's finding the one person who sees you when the rest of the world is blind. Aidan and Beatrice traded the glittering cruelty of London for a leaky roof and honest love, proving that you can't put a price on peace. What did you think of their escape from high society? Would you have traded the ballrooms for Somerset? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this grounded, emotional, historical romance, make sure to like this video, share it with your fellow book lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic storytelling. Until next time.